So today we're going to talk about approaching research with a critical eye, research, advocacy, and the truth. So let me just give you a little bit of background about both this presentation and me. So I was trained as an economist. I say that a lot just because it informs the way that I look at data and research. For those of you that aren't familiar with economists tend to be obsessed with causality. So for the most part with economic journals, if something's not causal, they don't really want to publish it. So that's sort of where we come from in terms of economics. In terms of this presentation, really it started out with a bunch of conversations about research that gave or that came to conclusions that seemed either counterintuitive to defenders or was sort of contrary to what advocates and defenders really think is going on. And so, you know, we came at it thinking like, well, what do you do when you're confronted with data or study that you find troubling? And so as a researcher, I didn't really want to say something like, what happens when you don't like the results? Because I really think about it as a researcher, my job is to try to find the truth, which I don't believe there's one single truth, but research should be an ongoing, evolving conversation. And so that was sort of how I wanted to approach it. But we really want to talk about, you know, sort of what are the things that when you look at a study, you should start asking, what questions you should ask, and then sort of where to go from there. And all of this is my opinion, and I welcome everybody else's thoughts and feelings on this, please. I think it's something that we struggle with. So let's see if I can. There we go. Okay, so when preparing this, a couple of people asked me to just sort of go over what is typically meant by evidence-based practices, data-driven decision-making, because I use those in my little blurb. And then I also added performance management, because that's really big in our county. And I'm going to tell you what I think they are. I'm sure that there are other opinions, but evidence-based practices tend to be the idea that we want to implement things that have been studied in the past that show that the results that we've gotten are consistent with what the program was designed to do. So there's a program, there's been a study, the study says this program works. Those are the kind of programs that we want to implement. I think this comes from sort of deviating from the practice of I'm the expert, I know what to do, and I'm going to do it no matter what, you know, everything says. So the idea is that we're getting to a place where we're making more objective decisions and less personal opinion-based programs. Data-driven decision-making is really similar, but instead of there being studies, the idea is that you're constantly looking at data. You're trying to make decisions based on what the data actually says as opposed to the opinions of the practitioners, okay? So the idea is that practitioners say like, oh no, we're giving bond to everyone, and then you look at the data and, you know, 10% of the population is getting bonds. So it's sort of making sure that your gut feelings are in line with the data and what's actually going on. And then performance management is really this idea about coming up with key performance indicators or goals, objectives, measures, that kind of structure, where you look at sort of key performance indicators to determine which programs, which policies are really making the biggest impact. Something that I see as really driving a lot of this is the idea that, the cynical part of me, sometimes I'm too idealistic, sometimes I'm too cynical, just so that you know where I'm coming from. A lot of what it is that policymakers are not experts in every field. So the politicians know, maybe one or two things really, really well, and everything else they kind of have an idea about what they would like to see, but they're not really experts in the field. I think that they would like to have data and data points to look at to tell them exactly how everyone is doing in their organization. Okay, so I work for a county. The commissioners really only know, their one or two areas really well. Everything else is about them trying to figure out, are we doing the right things? And I think from their point of view, it would be easier if they could look at a couple of pieces of information and say, oh yeah, we're doing exactly what we should be doing. This number, we're hitting these marks, etc. And a lot of that comes from the business world where you're selling certain things. Unfortunately, in the public sphere, or fortunately, there are a lot of other things that we're not able to measure. So I think of half of my job as a researcher, as a data person in the county, is really reminding everybody that there are a lot of things that we care about that we don't measure. And so the idea that you can look at single measures and make decisions about which programs are better than others can lead you astray just as much as going with only your gut feeling. So I really think of data and studies as another piece of information, but not really the end-all be-all of managing. Okay, so I've been thinking about this a lot lately too, the role of a researcher versus the role of an advocate. And I think in our world, those two things get muddled all of the time. I think the idea of a completely objective researcher is obviously an ideal that we don't often meet. We all come at things with our own biases, with our own ideas, with our own political feelings about things. But I really like to think about it this way because I think it talks to the sort of responsibilities and then also the so I think of it as like responsibilities of researchers and then the rights of advocates. So people get mad when advocates will pick data that they like and say like, this is the piece of information that I want you all to look at. So it's not my favorite thing when it happens because there's obviously a lot going on, but I think that that is the right of an advocate. An advocate has said, this is what I believe in. These are the things that I think support that belief. And understanding that that's where they come from, you sort of are already looking at that as what other information should I gather so that I'm not just looking at what they believe. As a researcher, I really think that it's important to be as honest as you can about your research, about what your research actually says. I think that that's really something that everyone struggles with, that not all researchers even care about. And it doesn't always lead to success in the researcher field to be completely and totally honest about the shortcomings of your research. Some people see sharing, future research ideas as giving away their intellectual property, so they struggle with that also. But I am still very idealistic about research. I still think that as a researcher, I try to be as critical and upfront about the information that I'm giving. And I think one thing that researchers really can do is say, you know, we're looking at a study where we show this effect, but we're missing X, Y, and Z, and that will either make the effect smaller or bigger depending on whether we think these things are important. So that's sort of what we're doing. So where do you start when you start reading a piece of research that really is either counterintuitive or, I mean, honestly, any piece of research, even if you think like the result is great, I'm going to share this with everyone, it's going to change the face of indigent defense, they're going to give us all the money in the world. I think you really want, every time you start reading research, looking at research, is to remember that no single study is going to tell the whole story. I do not believe we're in a place where we can really look at the data and understand the entire story of even an individual program, okay? And that's true even if you have a randomized controlled trial. So, you know, we love RTCs. It's like, oh, look, we have this, we randomized people between these two effects. It was really well done. They took into consideration all these different issues. And we got these results, so that's going to apply to everyone everywhere. And it turns out that's not true either, that implementing programs in different jurisdictions, depending on what your structures are, small things can have big changes in sort of the outcomes of programs. And so we still have to be aware of sort of what all is going on there. Every time you read a study, it should be why. Why? So why did we get these results? What jurisdiction are we looking at? What outcomes are we looking at? What are you controlling for? That's a huge thing, right? So a lot of times we use what data we have. We look at, oh, well, we have this data. We can control for gender and age, but there are a lot of things that we can't control for because we don't measure. How much is that driving those results? Why are these the measures we chose? Often that's the data we had available. So, you know, it's easy to measure, when you have the data, the conviction rate. It's not easy to measure how many people got their children taken away as a result of confinement, how many people lost their job because they were in jail for 2 more days. Those sorts of things are much, much harder to measure currently. Some of them eventually, I think, if we get integrated data, different databases, we'll be able to measure. But there are things that we care about in social science that I don't think we'll ever fully be able to measure. And those things can really matter. So you want to make sure that, so like studies that look at crime rates, right? Like, so has the crime rate increased? Are we less safe because of this policy? So maybe, you know, crime has increased as a result of policy, but it's because people's rights are being respected. So that changes from really thinking about what's the best policy implementation to a much higher, more philosophical question of what is it that we want as a society? If we only want zero crime, then there are a lot of ways to achieve that. But I think for most people in the United States, that's not the ideal. We value freedoms. We value certain rights. We believe that the way that we treat each other matters. And as a result, sometimes you'll see certain things happen as a result of respecting rights. The question is, how do we then deal with these two different ideals and balance them? You know, how much do we want, how much are we willing to give up our rights in order to have less crime? And that's a different discussion than just looking at a study and saying, oh, this increased crime rates, we can't do that at all. You also always want to ask, is this causal? So, excuse me. What's causing these results? So not just is the econometric, or is the statistics, are the econometrics, are those even able to get at a causal result? Excuse me. But what is the mechanism? What's causing that result? Okay, so if we see something like crime rates increase because we respect people's rights more, what's really causing that, right? So the idea might be, well, you know, people are getting out of jail and they're able to commit more crimes, blah, blah, blah. It might also be that the law enforcement gets irritated with the rest of us and decides they shouldn't have to police certain things. There are all sorts of things that can be causing this, and I think we really have a responsibility to think deeply about all of the things. It's a big ball of yarn, and we should really try to detangle that as much as possible. So a little bit more technical stuff. These are words you may hear or they're important, and I'm happy to talk more about those in general or about specific studies, but often things that you care about are correlated. So recently in our jurisdiction, someone did a study looking at low-level drug crimes. And one of the things that they controlled for is the type of attorney. Was it a hired attorney, or we have a managed assigned counsel jurisdiction, so, or was it an assigned counsel? And they said the only thing that mattered was the type of counsel for the outcome of the case. The only thing in their model that mattered. So, you know, they had race, number of prior arrests mattered, but that was okay. A couple of other things, and then the type of counsel. What is really missing from that analysis is that the type of counsel is almost perfectly correlated with the income of the individual, because someone only gets assigned counsel if they're poor. And so to say that this is what's driving this result, I think would be misleading, that there are a lot of other things, and that if we really want to fix the problem, then we need to look not only at the type of counsel, but that other things that disparately impact people with lower incomes. So there are a lot of correlations with things when you look at the data and say, like, well, this is what's driving that. You have to think about, like, well, what else could that be masking? What kind of things is that really not controlling for? This is similar to missing variables. So what aren't we controlling for that we should be? Often we control for what we can because we have it in the data. But maybe there are things that we really would like to be controlling for, and being cognizant of that and really thinking about what we want to control for will really help us create better data in the future and understand studies better. Identification strategies, so this is again back to this causalness. There are a lot of different ways to, identification means, can I tell whether or not this coefficient is really a causal coefficient. So a lot of you may have heard of instrumental variables. Excuse me. Instrumental variables is a identification strategy that uses, excuse me, uses variation that is not one of the things you necessarily control for to help identify sort of causal effects. There's still a lot of debate. So people act like, okay, this is it. Like any instrumental variables, as long as this and this is true, is going to give us a perfect identification strategy, and it'll tell us really a lot of information. I think there's still a lot of debate about how much is that really the truth? Are we really getting at the information that we want? Power, how powerful is your model? So this is something that a lot of times we ignore. We don't really think a lot about, is this the right model to describe this? Most regressions, most of the stuff that we read is linear, so that's a linear approximation to what may be a very non-linear process. So that comes under model, really, power and model. Are there things that are going on? Are we trying to make big leaps from where we are? Because really that linear approximation may be only a very local approximation. So those are really a lot more technical issues, but things that you can sort of ask about. And if you're asking somebody, you know, well, what do you say about these things? That can help a little bit. Okay, so my biggest fears when I present information or when I work on studies is that we always measure what's easy. We measure what we have available because it's available. Using data in social science is still incredibly new. If we think about how long people have been using data and experimentation in the sciences and still how little we know about things like the brain, we really have to be careful about data. And because it's easy to understand a number and it's hard to understand policy, people will often just measure what's easy, what they can get away with. I see this all the time with policymakers. They want to focus on a single number. So you present all this information like this, you know, recidivism rates are this, or the number of jail days someone's spending are this, and conviction rates have changed this way. And they'll focus on a single number. They'll say, well, you know, jail days have increased by 2 for that group. So why should we continue to fund this? Ignoring the fact that there may be reasons for those increases that are actually good for the defendant, good for the county, good for the world in general. It's hard to overcome that, though. And so that's one of those things I really talk about in terms of when you're interpreting data, be careful about not getting that sort of focus, that lock. And then in terms of what gets published, counterintuitive results are sometimes much more compelling to report. People in economics, I shouldn't say this completely, but a counterintuitive result is always super fun. Oh, we all thought this was going to happen, and then that's really the outcome. And I think that's because it says, like, we're missing something. We're not understanding this completely. What's going on? And it gives researchers something to think about. When you're doing policy, just because something's fun and interesting and you want to research it more, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best way to think about the policy. With counterintuitive results, we should always say, I mean, and with all research, I mean, it's really a jumping off point. It's a, why is this happening? What's going on? What else can we look at? What future research can we look at that'll really get us the answers that we want? Okay, so is the studying really measuring what matters? So are we really looking at things that we care about? So those are sort of the thoughts I put together. I would love to hear about either people's, how they've used research or how they've confronted research they found confounding or difficult. So if anyone, you can either type comments in the chat. Andy can unmute you, I think, if he muted you.
Yes, I'll go ahead and unmute everybody now. If it becomes cacophonous, I'll try and identify the culprits. But hopefully we can engage in a discussion.